Hello and welcome to the Marine Biological Association's podcast, The Marine Biologist. This podcast is the accompaniment to our magazine, also called The Marine Biologist, and it explores the current issues that face our ocean. If you'd like to find out more about the Marine Biological Association or where you can get your hands on the Marine Biologist magazine, then please visit our website, www.mba.ac.uk. Enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the Marine Biologist podcast. I'm Kathy and I'm going to pass you over to Guy Baker in a moment, our editor of the Marine Biologist magazine, to introduce our guest today.
Hello everyone, welcome to this Marine Biologist podcast. We're delighted today to welcome Professor David Sims, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Marine Biological Association, where he leads the Movement, Ecology and Conservation of Ocean Predators Research Group. David's research involves understanding animal movements using satellite tracking, as well as direct observation in the field. And the talk today relates to a recent article in the Marine Biologist magazine, which dealt with circling of basking sharks that was observed off the west coast of Ireland. Hello, David, and welcome.
Hello. Great to be here.
So I know Guy's just told us a little bit about the research that you do, David, but I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on that and just tell us what it is in general that you do.
Yeah, Guy did a good job there, actually. So there's probably not too much to add other than, I guess, the main thrust of our work in the group, and the group's been based here at the MBA for 23 years and had lots of group members come through and then go on to brilliant careers elsewhere. And that's one of the pleasures, actually, of doing the research and having a research group at the MBA for that length of time, is that you really develop a great sort of network of former students and postdocs. And really what all of those people over that time, what we've been trying to understand is more about the behavior of sharks. When I first started on my PhD in 1991, there were only 3 other PhD students in the UK studying sharks and rays, shark skates and rays. Yeah, it seems incredible to think that whereas now, luckily, and it's a good thing, that many more people are attracted to that research area. And one of the reasons that it's become more accessible, I think, for a whole range of researchers is in part the technology that we're now able to use to understand more about where they go and what they do and why they might be doing it. And obviously, as we'll all appreciate, that mirrored surface of the sea, the sharks are behaving and doing what they do below it. And we have to get a window into that world. And the technology that I've been using over the last 20 odd years has really allowed us to peer into their murky world. And so the behavior we're interested in is all aspects of understanding their movement and why they make the types of movements they do. In other words, what structures their movement patterns. This can be foraging movements, it could be home ranging movements, right up to highly migratory movements. And we want to understand what the drivers are, what are the triggers of those behaviors, and how that knowledge of knowing where they are and where they want to be at certain times, how we can use that to approach improving their conservation. Because obviously over the last half century, many of the species have declined in their population abundance due to anthropic factors such as fishing, for example.
So would you say that's your main motivation for doing the research that you do to be able to better protect them?
I think that's emerged from the work we've done. I mean, when I first started, my PhD research, for example, was all about understanding the physiology of behavior, and so what makes the shark tick, I suppose, was one of our sort of main questions. What determines the timing of their activity and how long they'll spend feeding, and when will they start feeding again? These are all quite basic questions, but really hard to answer in a mechanistic sense. And I think that from those fundamental questions, that transferred into many of our subsequent research into shark movements and their wider ranging activities. But in doing so, we understood that actually that was useful to improve their conservation status. And I guess the good example is with the basking shark. It wasn't really until we started satellite tracking their movements that we really understood where the individuals spent time. And it was only then by thinking about the fact that they tend to remain fairly home-loving. They show fidelity to certain areas around the UK, that we were able to frame that in a conservation setting. In other words, it was possible for there to be overfishing of basking shark for the previous 2 centuries, because if we'd seen a decline in numbers, then it was likely that the population had declined, because they tend to remain more or less in the same place. So it was from fundamental questions that we were led into applying that to these sort of conservation, more applied type questions.
David, why is the UK and Ireland a hotspot for basking sharks?
That's a really good question. And I guess the answer is that there happens to be lots of plankton productivity close to the surface. And I think we always think of basking sharks as their name suggests, is spending lots of time at the surface. In fact, they spend a lot of time below the surface, obviously, and they're ranging through the water column down to 1,000 or more meters. But when they're around the UK on our continental shelf, obviously their depth is limited. And the fact that there's very high plankton productivity, not just zooplankton that they feed on, the little animals in the plankton, but also lots of phytoplankton, which many of the prey that they're interested in feed on. And that happens to be in high concentration close to the surface. It's that mix of the correct temperatures and water chemistry, nutrients, that contributes to that increase in growth seasonally. And that high availability of zooplankton prey at the surface really is the thing that controls when we see them. It just so happens that they feed on this zooplankton that's close to the surface in spring to summer months. And that's when we on our headlands or on boats actually then see them. But our research showed that they were actually present in the UK, around the UK, all of the year. Some individuals do range into deeper water further south, but many of them remain just, tens of kilometers from the coastline. They're just deeper in the water and we don't see them at that time. So they're here for the food. It's a hotspot because it's a very productive region, the North European shelf of the UK. It's actually I guess one of the sort of, if you looked at a modelled surface of phytoplankton concentration, it's one of the hotspots in the Atlantic, as is the Gulf Stream and the upwelling of the Iberian Peninsula. The North Atlantic shelf area around the UK and Ireland is a hotspot for that productivity, and that's what draws the sharks here. Either they're remaining all year round, or they move back up from further south in time to feed on that seasonally available zooplankton.
Going on to the article about this incredible circling behaviour of large sharks that's you observed off the west coast of Ireland, and you've been researching basking sharks for many years. But when you saw that, what was the most striking thing about that circling behaviour of these big sharks?
Yeah, it was incredible, isn't it? I started working on basking sharks in 1995, in the summer of 1995. I'd seen them maybe 5 or 6 years previously, and not been able to study them at that time. One has to finish PhDs and all that sort of stuff, and try and get jobs and grant money and all the things that make the science possible. But summer 95 was when I first started sort of observing them and taking our scientific observations. And it was evident then that most of the time you saw them, they were feeding with mouth wide open, that characteristic white mouth, ploughing through the water, essentially sort of mowing the lawn, as it were, going backwards and forwards along these zooplankton patches. And that's over the next sort of 10 years that I spent in the field with colleagues in my group and others. We tended to see them most, in that behavior, that feeding behavior. Only rarely did we see individuals stop feeding and swim off on a straight line course to try and find another patch. And we described that in our papers. We tracked those individuals using boats and measured what they were feeding on and so on. And we found, we were able to determine what levels of zooplankton which they would cease feeding and then start feeding again. And that was all really interesting. But as I say, rarely did we see them not feeding. So when I was sent the footage by an amazing underwater photographer called Ken O'Sullivan, who works mainly in Ireland off that incredible, west coast, absolutely incredible coastline, and that is so rich in diversity of animals, not least these huge, marine megafauna, whales and sharks and tunas. And he sent me this footage. He'd heard through others that I'd worked on basking sharks, and I might be someone to ask, what on earth was this behavior? And he showed me the movie he sent me was just a few minutes long, but it was of 16 basking sharks, huge, giant basking sharks. We tended, when we were seeing them foraging off Plymouth, for example, in the English Channel, we did see them from about 2.5 meters long to 8 meters long. So we got the full sort of range. But most of them were about 5-6 meters. It was evident that these sharks were circling around in a really tight circle. Weird, strange, not usual for a sort of foraging situation. But they were all large, 7, 8, 9 meters long. And the amazing thing about them, the two things, I suppose, one is none of them were feeding, not even trying to, not even opening their mouths in that feeding pattern, opening their mouths obviously to take in water, to breathe, water breathing. And the other amazing thing was that there were males and females present of these large sizes. And this just struck me as being so different to anything I'd really spent time working on in the sort of 10 years that I spent at sea, and then another 5-10 years actually trying to, write some of the stuff up. This was so different. And when Ken, I got back in touch, I said, this is incredible. We have to write something about this. We have to describe it and let folks know about it. He then said, oh, yeah, a friend of mine saw one as well, some kilometers away, a few days later. I was like, oh, wow. So then that person, a guy called Nick Pfeiffer, he sent me his footage. Again, incredible. Large sharks not feeding, males and females present. But one thing that both of them noticed, and it just shows, doesn't it, that people who are making films or making observations, doing surveys, they're really good at spotting nuances, small details. Both Ken and Nick said to me, do you know what? I think the males were darker than the females. And that was a real key observation, because I knew from previous sort of work I'd done on sharks that, the sexes do differ in color when they get into courtship and reproductive behavior. So that really piqued my interest. And so I thought, well, okay, we've got two circles here. And we quickly named them toruses, because they struck us as being, it's a 3-dimensional sort of, circling ring. And there is a mathematical, description of that is a torus. So we called it that. And I thought, well, let's describe these two toruses and write a scientific paper by having precise descriptions of what was going on. But then I got into that, and that took a while. Myself and Emily Southall, who works in the group as well, started looking at this. And we realized it was a lot more complicated, because we had to identify each individual in the torus, figure out whether they were male or female, and then follow them as they made these circles around to check their interactions. What sort of interactions were they making? But then whilst we were involved in that, Simon Barrow got in touch with me, another researcher, a field researcher off West Island, and said, "Oh yeah, I've got footage as well." So he then sent me all these films of these tortoises over a couple of years. Before we knew it, we had 20 tortoises, individual tortoises to analyze. And that took a long time. That was a lot of effort, but it was really worth it.
That sounds like, did you just drop everything else you were doing? That sounds like such an exciting sort of moment as you describe it.
Yeah, for a shark sort of behavioural ecologist like me, it really made me sit up and think, wow, I thought I knew something about this species, but now I realise I don't know much. And I couldn't drop everything else. I mean, I had various other projects going on blue sharks, for example, and other oceanic sharks like short fin mako sharks. We were satellite tracking them in the North Atlantic and calculating their overlap with fisheries, which is really important research that we couldn't stop. So myself and Emily and a few other members of my group, Nuna Kairosh, Freya Womersley, and Nick Humphreys, we worked on it sort of in our spare time almost. It was a project that we sort of tried to get done in parallel. And it was actually something that really took off during COVID, actually, when we were working at home. I'm not saying there was more time, but you could do sort of a few more things that you weren't traveling so much or whatever. And that's when we started to put the analysis into shape and really start to explore and hopefully understand a little bit about the complex behaviours that were going on.
Mm. And you've alluded to it a little bit. And for those that haven't read the article, what did you learn? What were they doing? Why were they forming these tortoises?
Yeah, well, I've touched on it a little by saying, that the males and the females were different colours. And this is something that is seen in other sharks when they're engaged in courtship. And so initially, when I first saw those films that the incredible field researchers shared with us, I immediately thought of courtship behaviour because I'd seen it before. Sharks following each other for long periods of time. But sometimes in that behavior, the so-called nose-to-tail following, they would often open their mouths to feed. And so there'd been some contention among researchers. I'd sort of suggested this was sort of, the early stages of courtship where animals, after they've been feeding for a long period, they come into some sort of condition and then they maybe switch to this sort of courtship behavior where ultimately the males and the females will pair up and then that will lead to mating. And I initially thought that this was a more advanced sort of stage of the courtship. And nothing we found in the study falsified that view, that initial impression. We looked at the numbers of males and females in the tortoises, and they were about equal. It wasn't dominated particularly by one sex over another. The sizes, they did vary, but on average, they were sharks that were about 7.5 meters long. It ranged from 9.5 down to, there was a little sort of spratty little male that was zooming around on the inside of one of these tortoises that was about 5 meters long, or 5.5. So, I mean, he's still a whopper of a shark, but a real shrimp compared to the others that were in there. And the sorts of interactions between the sharks, so equal sexes. There was also, we found damage to the female pectoral fins, which would be an expectation because males of sharks tend to grasp the female by the pectoral fins to get in the right position to insert one of their claspers into the female cloaca. And also the behaviors, the interactions between them were really some of the things we'd seen before. So the nose to tail following was there, the sort of the close flank approach, the parallel swimming, very close together within, a meter or so of each other. But then sometimes they would touch. They would touch fins. There would be fin to fin contact. There would be fin to body contact. But I guess one of the things that really sort of maybe exemplified more than any other that this was a courtship behavior was when both males and females to the opposite sex were showing their ventral areas. So they would roll onto their side and show the ventral area to the following shark. And that would also be coupled with nodding behavior, this sort of nodding of the head, the dorsoventral sort of flexing of the body. The tail would be going up and down, the head would be going up and down. So there were these really subtle body posture changes that were happening, as well as the sort of contacts. And I think that altogether, the fact that you've got large sharks, they're not feeding, there's equal numbers of males and females, as well as these really subtle contacts and showing of ventral areas, really sort of cemented it for us that this was a courtship assemblage that we were looking at. And then one of the most amazing things is that these toruses were forming. There was fusion and fission of these. We saw the same individuals in different toruses. We never saw the start of one and the complete end of it, because it seems like that would last for some hours. But certainly there were the different toruses occurring on the same day in different locations close to each other, with individuals moving between them. So this was an incredibly dynamic set of behaviors that were occurring after the animals had spent a few months feeding.
So you don't know what happened next then? You said that you never saw these finish. So once the courtship was over, you don't have any information on whether they paired up and went off?
Yeah, we got some tantalite, because as well as the underwater footage, we got drone footage from these awesome researchers. Simon Barrow in particular supplied all these incredible drone images looking down on the torus, and we could really start to match up the positions of the sharks in the torus with who was who. Who was female number 6 and male number 9 and all this kind of thing. But we never got to the stage of seeing a pair actually then move away and actually conduct any sort of mating behavior. One of the reasons, I guess, is this was happening at the surface. These toruses were at the surface, which probably is a bit unusual, because basking sharks, like most sharks, are negatively buoyant, slightly negatively buoyant, these pelagic sharks. And so generally when a male and female shark come together, with one grabbing the other fin, they reduce their swimming movements. And then at a stage in that behavior, they go into a state of tonic immobility, where they cease swimming. And of course, if you're negatively buoyant, you cease swimming, you'll sink. So it could be that we weren't seeing the actual mating because it was happening on the sea or near the seabed. And so, that's the basking shark is full of mysteries and wrapped up in enigmas and all that sort of thing. And it's just another one of those mysteries that it still holds, and we haven't peeled back the layers on that one yet.
And in the article, you mentioned that you measured energy expenditure of basking sharks. A two-part question: how do you measure how much energy a big creature like that is using? And secondly, do basking sharks use less energy when they're meandering up and down these fronts of zooplankton compared to your kind of more typical in the imagination shark that dashes after larger prey?
Hold on a minute. You said you were going to ask easy questions in this podcast. Those are two really difficult questions to answer. The first one, basking sharks are large, obviously, and it's true of any large shark, actually. Anything over about 36 kilograms, especially the fast-swimming ones, no shark over 36 kilograms has ever had its metabolic rate measured directly. And there's logistical reasons for that. Putting a fast-swimming shark into a device where you could measure its metabolic rate, you normally do it by proxy by measuring the consumption of oxygen, so the decline in oxygen in a volume of water. And for the active sharks, you have to swim them against a current. Well, no one yet, although we do have a grant actually at the moment that we're planning to build a mega flume that would enable us to put these oceanic sharks and measure their metabolic rate directly as they're swimming in a current. But until we get to that point, everything that's happened before, really, for these large sharks has been by indirect means. And what I mean by indirect means is, so for example, for the basking shark 20 years ago, I had this idea that if a basking shark is feeding on plankton, then the decision to feed must be based on something. It must be based on some sensory information from some internal state that it's receiving, it's obtaining enough food, not only to match what it costs to collect it, but to exceed that and for the animal to grow. I reasoned that when they stop feeding, that must be the point, more or less, at which the costs of gain that you get from the plankton matches or balances that of the costs of its collection. And so because we knew what the threshold density of zooplankton was, we'd spent a number of years tracking the sharks and measuring plankton with nets and stuff like that. We'd actually found that the magic number was about 0.6 grams wet weight of zooplankton per meter cubed. Below that, they tended to stop feeding. Above that, they started feeding, and one imagines as the densities get up, and some of the densities we were measuring in their feeding paths were, over 20 grams, wet weight grams of zooplankton per meter cube, which is a lot. That's a big, it's a big chunk. If you put it in a little bottle, there's a big chunk of copepods in there. That tends to be what they're trying to select, those patches with the most numerous, dense, large, oil-rich copepods. That's what they're into. So anyway, that reasoning between, them ceasing feeding and starting feeding, I figured must be a value that was close to some sort of cost, some sort of metabolic cost. And so I calculated all this and, sort of did sensitivity analyses to figure if I was way out and if I was just, making this stuff up. And incredibly, it came out at a number that wasn't crazy at all, that was about 80 milligrams of oxygen per kilogram per hour. Now, to most folks, they'll hear that number and the units, and that won't mean anything. But you think about it, well, a Greenland shark, so this lives in cold water, doesn't move around much. That's been measured more or less directly at about 20 milligrams of oxygen per kilogram per hour. A mako shark, a small mako, has been put in a direct measuring device, a so-called respirometer, and has been measured at about I think it's about 200 milligrams of oxygen per kilogram per hour. So you can see there that there's a big shift. Obviously, smaller animals have higher metabolic rates relatively. So we'd expect the small mako to, zooming around, catching its prey to have a higher metabolic rate. But compared to the big Greenland shark, the basking shark's higher, but the numbers aren't crazily different. They're not orders of magnitude different. So we know that the basking shark, indirectly, its cost will be lower than that of a shark that zooms around catching, silvery fishes. And it's going to be above that of a much, of a species that lives in colder water. So the number is sort of somewhere in between. It could be that we're not accurate. It could be that it's 50% more. But even if it is, it's not crazily different. And so I think that the costs, what that means is that the cost of a basking shark feeding is relatively low compared to some of these other oceanic predators. But then, in a sense, that makes sense because, perhaps one of the reasons that large body size has evolved is to equalize the heterogeneity in the plankton environment out there. We know that plankton is highly heterogeneous. It's highly variable, sparse, and then suddenly you get these big sort of hotspots of zooplankton availability. And the basking shark has got to not only figure out where to go to find those patches, but has got to weather the sort of storm of starvation in between. And so that's why I guess large body size has been selected for. I guess among other reasons as well, that won't be the sole driver.
That's a very comprehensive answer, David. Thank you. Lots to think about. What limits the population of basking sharks? Is it the availability of food? I mean, I think you've kind of really talked about it on an individual level, but on a population level, is it availability of zooplankton, or are there other factors?
Yeah, clearly the availability of what it feeds on, sufficient densities of the most energy rich zooplankton is going to be key to an individual's success, and that's going to percolate through the population. Where you see lots of these sharks, they're going to be successful if they find those dense patches. So yes, I guess at the scale at which they range around in a summer, and we tracked one that went from Plymouth. We just tagged it off the breakwater here, just outside the NBA. We tagged it on the 24th of May, and then by the 8th of August, it was off Western Scotland, feeding on tidal fronts up there. It had gone around the west of Ireland, and that's just in a few weeks. So they're incredibly able to move long distances, and they're using that ability of highly migratory nature, low cost probably of transport, to move around the shelf, find those hotspots. But they're doing that within an envelope, a thermal envelope. So temperature probably limits their distributional range, where it definitely limits their distributional range. I mean, they are known from the White Sea off Russia. The odd individual has gone up there. They seem to be increasing off Norway, and there are lots of questions there about climate effects, shifting polewards the distributions of these filter feeding sharks. But undoubtedly, what's determined their population size probably over the last 200 years in the Northeast Atlantic is fishing. Humans have hunted basking sharks and other oceanic and pelagic sharks for centuries. I mean, longline fishing, the equipment for that has been found in Paleolithic sites. In fact, going back to sort of 40-odd thousand years ago, there was, bone hooks on long lines. So people were catching tunas and sharks a long time ago. And probably the basking shark is one of those species that probably has been harvested for a long, long time because of its proximity to the coast and to remote communities. They've probably harvested these for centuries. But the mechanized, the sort of industrialized fishing really had gone on probably from about the 1930s onwards, using these harpoons, and latterly in the 1940s, these sort of gas-powered harpoons, explosive harpoons, to catch basking sharks. And so it was interesting that the number of sightings, the number of catches and sightings, declined precipitously between about 1930s, 1940s through to the 1970s. In various locations off Ireland and Scotland, there were big declines in the sightings of sharks. And I guess that was one of the contentions in attempts to get the basking shark protected, because on the one hand, it's going to be K-selected species. It's long-lived if given the chance. It's large. It takes a long time to get to maturity, sexual maturity. It doesn't have many offspring either. Its fecundity is low. It's thought that it only has about 6, and that could happen only every 2 or 3 years, perhaps. So really low rates of replacement. And so it seemed reasonable that the declines that were being seen in sightings and ones being caught were due to overfishing. But at the time, there was strong pushback from fishing nations that actually the basking shark could just be moving somewhere else. That it's a large scale movement of the sharks that is responsible for this decline, rather than the overfishing. And that's where the satellite tracking came in the early sort of 2000s that we did, and that fed directly into the CITES proposal, the Appendix 2. Because what we were able to show there was that the basking sharks weren't really moving. They weren't making those huge seasonal, not all individuals were shifting from one place to another, from one side of the Atlantic to the other. So it couldn't account for the decline that was being seen. We were finding that the sharks were remaining pretty faithful. And that led us to infer that it's likely that the population that was generally resident around the Northeast Atlantic was probably overfished. We know that from about 1950 through to the 70s, if you add it all up, the Norwegian vessels that were harpooning, the Scottish vessels, the Irish vessels, if you add it all up, it's about 120,000 basking sharks in that period of time. Now, given that we don't know the population sizes with any reasonable certainty, then it's difficult to know what kind of impact that has had. However, I would just say that the fishers tended to catch the largest shark that was available on that day in that particular group of sharks. So it's likely that most of that 120,000 were the largest individuals, which of course were the reproductively active ones. Females, aren't sexually mature till at least 7 meters long. Males, about 5 meters, 6 meters long. So they've got to spend a lot of time in the ocean before they'll get to that maturity. So I think everything was pointing to the basking shark having been overfished for probably half a century. And that led to very low numbers. And that's why the protection in 2003 for CITES and then for the conservation of migratory species, the CMS, in 2006. And I'm pleased to say that our research, our sort of fundamental curiosity-driven research, was part of the information, the documentation, the evidence that was presented to enable those protections to be put in place, those international protections.
I mean, so many questions and so much in that, David. Thank you. But I'm surprised, actually, when you say that basking sharks were really fished. I mean, is there an active fishery for basking sharks these days? And fished for what purpose? Are they food? What are we using them for?
Yeah, that's it. They were used initially. The main reason they were fished is because they were found to have large livers, which of course had oil in them. Okay. I mentioned before about the buoyancy of these pelagic sharks and how they're slightly negatively buoyant. The reason that they have any buoyancy at all, even getting close to negatively buoyant, is because of the static lift they get from the oil that's in the liver. And basking sharks, about a quarter of their body weight is liver. And so the livers were found to be not only large, but full of oil. And so these were rendered down, and the oil was used to light the lamps and streets of London before whale oil. Well, in fact, whale oil was used initially, but then whales started declining in number. Basking shark oil took over for a while before gas and then subsequently electricity. So yeah, basking shark oil was used to light the streets of London at one stage. But also in some communities, obviously in some nations, the meat was used. And also various products made from the skin, for example, the sort of sandpaper-like skin. And that's true of most of our oceanic sharks, which are still being fished in high numbers. The blue shark, for example, only recently as the short-fin mako shark that we've worked on received any sort of international protection. And they were used for meat and fins. Fins were the thing that was driving the pelagic sharks like blues and makos. That was driving the harvesting of those. For basking shark, it was initially the oil, but latterly it became the fin. So even, the last sort of fishery that was going on in the Northeast Atlantic for basking shark, organized fishery, was still operating in the 1990s, can you believe? So when I started this research, there was still a harpoon fishery for basking shark. It seems incredible now.
Wow.
You imagine it now in the UK and Ireland, if basking sharks were being seasonally harpooned using those explosive harpoons. You can imagine the pushback from the public. And that's actually very good, because that shows us how far we've come. We've still got a lot to do with the oceanic sharks, for sure. They've declined by, 70% of population, abundance, relative abundance over the last 50 years. But for basking shark, I do feel, having been involved for this length of time, I've kind of seen how the work's been used and the sorts of instruments, legal instruments that have been put in place, that I do feel we've turned a corner, because the fisheries are essentially closed. There's still incidental catches in trawl gear and other sorts of gill nets, static gear. And occasionally you do see one on, you see on Twitter a photo of one being sold in a market somewhere. But generally speaking, I feel that the tide has turned, that basking sharks are one of the most protected species. And the fisheries have been removed. There is the opportunity now, I think, for the populations to bounce back. And hopefully that's something we're seeing in recent years. We've seen an increase in numbers off West Island, for example, an increase in numbers off Scotland. However, it's never as simple as all that, is it? Because we've seen fewer in the Channel, actually. So if I were trying to do my research now, I couldn't do it in the Channel. I'd have to move somewhere else. Whereas when I started in the 90s through to the mid 2000s, we were seeing huge numbers of basking sharks here, and that's partly what controls where they appear is obviously that zooplankton distribution and abundance that I mentioned earlier. But also, it could be now that we're seeing good numbers, and certainly these, a high number of these courtship circles, these toruses, because the species is starting to bounce back.
David, these tracking devices attached to these wide-ranging animals, have they shown up other aspects of ocean health?
Yeah, good question. I think telemetry, that's the name given to this sort of remote tracking of marine animals, and obviously basking shark. In fact, the basking shark was the first marine animal to be tracked with satellite back in the early 1980s, 1982. And that was by an incredible scientist called Monty Priede at Aberdeen University, who not only had the foresight to want to know more about the large-scale movements of marine animals, but had the ability to build his own satellite transmitter that would talk to these polar orbiting satellites that had only just gone up into space in 1978. And they were the ones that oceanographers were using to track buoys, drifting buoys, to get ideas of ocean currents. And he was one of the first to realize, wow, I could use those to track animals that came to the surface. Incredible insight. And a really, really incredible scientist that really started this avalanche of technology, the availability of this technology. It's since miniaturized a lot. I mean, of course, the tag that he put on was the size of a small boat, but now they're down to stuff that will fit in the palm of your hand. Incredible insights have been made over the last 20 years in particular. I mean, in depth use, for example, how deep do sharks go? Whale sharks have been tracked down to 2,000 meters. Even small sort of 1.5 meter mako sharks, we've tracked ourselves down to over 1,500 meters deep in complete darkness. They're in the midnight zone. The question arises, what on earth are they doing down there? Why do they bother to go down into water that's 5 degrees C, that's completely dark? These questions still remain to be answered. In terms of ocean health, I mean, one of the projects we're really excited about at the moment that we're doing is called ocean deoxyfish. And I think telemetry generally is now at that stage. We're just getting to the stage where we've tracked the individual species and populations for about 20 years. So we're starting to see changes in their distribution. And we're starting to relate those changes to climate, for example. And the Ocean Deoxyfish project that I'm really excited about, that we're running from the MBA here, funded by the European Research Council, is to understand how sharks are interacting with and utilizing areas of low oxygen. And it would seem counterintuitive that high oxygen demand predators like blues and makos and other sharks are actually occurring and choosing to remain near areas with low oxygen. But I guess one thing is that, I guess the answer to why they're there is still being resolved. We're still tracking, we're still trying to understand, putting little video cameras on them to see what they might be feeding on, and so on. But one of the reasons why we should be concerned about that is because the ocean is losing its breath. The ocean is losing oxygen. Over the last 50 years, about 1 to 2% of the ocean's oxygen inventory has been lost. It's predicted that in the next 100 years, that will expand further to between 1 and 7% of ocean oxygen. So those areas of persistent oxygen, low oxygen, called hypoxic zones, are expanding. And this is important to sharks for a few reasons. One is that hypoxia expanding is actually forcing animals which are hypoxia intolerant into surface waters. So these oxygen minimum zones tend to be at depth from about 200 to 800 meters. So anything above there or close to there will get shunted further towards the surface. And that's one reason, one of our early results for blue sharks and short-fin mako sharks was that they were moving south from the North Atlantic. They were going south to an area off West Africa. And we were surprised that that was an area of a very marked, persistent oxygen minimum zone. And we wondered whether that was due to increased foraging opportunities. Was it that the ocean environment and how it's changing, how these expanding oxygen minimum zones are expanding to, compress the habitat of prey species? Maybe sharks are taking advantage of that and going to these areas where they can then hunt in smaller volumes. So we're exploring all those ideas, and we're finding that actually blue sharks in particular can punch into these oxygen minimum zones. They seem to be able to dive into them, to move and to hunt. How they do it physiologically is something we're developing tags with our colleague in Portugal, Nuno Queiroz, his team, to actually measure the oxygen not only in the environment, but also in the shark themselves. So we will then be able to see physiologically how they're dealing with that really extreme environment. My last point on this is that in terms of ocean health, I mentioned previously about the catches of oceanic sharks that are happening. It's driving down populations, has done over the last 50 years. What we find in these oxygen minimum zones above them is that the fishers know that there are sharks resident there in high numbers because we've tracked the fishing boats just as we've tracked the sharks. They go back there again and again and have much higher catch rates than in adjacent areas. The fishing is not only the effort is higher, but it's more intense. That is, the amount of time between deployments of gear is much shorter, and the space between them is much less. So there's more intense fishing, and that leads to a catch per unit effort of sharks like blue sharks, for example, being 2 to 3 times higher in these climate-affected areas. So there are hotspots in the ocean of sharks. There are also hotspots of fishing, and these two, in this area off West Africa, these two areas, these two layers of sharks and fishing boats, these two collide. And so we're very concerned that in these areas, because of the high catch rates and the changing environment, that this is something that will continue to impact the population and will remain invisible without mitigation. And one of the mitigations we've proposed in one of our papers and through conservation policy is for spatial conservation, to have areas which are impacted most by climate, which then affect the distribution of animals, which cascades onto their catch rates, ramps up their catch rates above what they could be. And those areas are the ones which we think are the ones that we should give our attention to the most, because they're the areas that in the future are going to be more impacted than some other areas. If we have to get down to choosing in the ocean which areas to conserve over others, given that it's unreasonable to protect everything, of course, to conserve everything. If we have to choose, this is one of the areas that should be considered, this collision of shark behavior, climate change, and fishing. In the nexus of those points, we should seriously think about spatial protection, in my opinion.
I think it's reassuring that the science in this case seems to be keeping up with what's happening in the sea. And, there's evidence coming out, numbers to back up calls for conservation for sharks in these changing areas. And it kind of leads on to the next question, which is that we have a global agreement on protection of biodiversity in the high seas. And what do you think the treaty means for the protection of far-ranging pelagic predators?
Well, I hope it will mean that there'll be greater levels of protection than currently. Obviously, this treaty has only been agreed in the last few days. So this podcast is particularly timely in that context. And I still think we have to understand fully the nature of the treaty and also to work through and understand how that's going to be implemented. I think that's the key thing next. I think it has potential. It's been in the making for 15 years. And in the high seas area, it's much needed because, as I mentioned previously, pelagic sharks are being decimated, beyond decimated, in some of these oceanic areas. I think that the treaty has the potential to provide the sorts of spatial conservation that's required, as well as the controls on catches that will be required. But this is a really complex area. There's incredible pushback from industry, as you might, won't be surprising, that fishing nations want to protect their communities that rely on these catches for their livelihoods. And so there's pushback from that, and correctly so. Human welfare and well-being has to be considered in all of this. But at the same time, there is an opportunity to conserve the ocean such that if larger tracts are protected, as well as catch limits in other areas, control of catches, and making sure to release where there's bycatch, then there's a real chance to recover those populations. But without that combination of conservation, which I hope the treaty will implement, without that, we won't be able to recover populations to where they were even in the 1950s, let alone before that.
Like you say, it's such a complex issue, and that the discoveries that you've made over the years are, as Guy said, it's really good that those are keeping up with and hopefully informing the conservation of not just the sharks, but the whole of the environment. So not only thank you for the work that you do, but thank you so much for sharing it. As Guy said, I think people are just going to be fascinated. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that's an absolute pleasure. And, I should say that I think I mentioned it right at the start, and I'll just circle back to it. I'll loop back to it. The last 23 years, as my group's been based at the MBA, and it's that sort of that base, that laboratory base, and the availability of support funding, as well as our own grant funding, that's enabled it. And it's not only been a pleasure to do the research, but I'm really pleased that the MBA research has had the opportunity to contribute to these worldwide conservation measures. And I hope that that's a legacy that the MBA is proud of.
And if you're listening to this and you want to learn more, you can look at the Marine Biological Association website, which is www.mba.ac.uk. And do consider joining the Marine Biological Association, and you can get 4 editions of the Marine Biologist magazine a year and keep up with all the latest developments in marine biology. So thank you again, David. Fascinating talking to you, and a great podcast, and thank you from all of us.
Thank you very much for listening. This has been the Marine Biologist podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please check out our other episodes. Please subscribe to our podcast. Please rate it, share it with your friends and family, and let us know what you think. And we will look forward to welcoming you to the next episode soon. Take care.